Today, we are talking about transformations of a graph. So we're going to be looking at some graphing. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking a graph, we're going to be moving it around, and we're going to be stretching it and shrinking it. So we'll start the notes off with what is called a translation. Basic idea with a translation is that you move the graph. So you take a graph and you move it, but it remains the same shape. So it either moves left, right, or up, down. And there are some rules to know how the graph is being moved. The first one, the graph can be moved vertically. So it could be moved up or down. That happens when you have a constant that is being added or subtracted outside of the parentheses. For example, if we have y equals x squared, what would that be if we were to graph it? Parabola. If we were to look at something like y equals x squared plus 4, what that's telling us, plus 4 is outside the parentheses, so we're going to be moving vertically, and it's going to move exactly how you think it would. Plus 4 is going to move us up 4 units. So you're just taking the parabola y equals x squared and moving it up 4 units. Okay, we can also shift horizontally, so left, right. That happens when you add or subtract inside the parentheses. So again, if we look at y equals x squared, and then let's say instead of the 4 being outside, we wrote it like this. Those are different. So in blue, we're squaring the x, then adding 4. In green, we're adding 4, then we're squaring. So they're different. Because the 4 is in parentheses, this is telling us that we're moving left or right. When it's in parentheses, though, it's the opposite of what you think it would be. What do you think of plus 4 on a number line? Do you think of left or right?
No.
You would think it would be right. It's actually left. So this one is going to move us left 4 units. So we would take our y equals x squared and move it left 4 units. So that is what's hardest to remember. When it's in parentheses, opposite of what you think it would be. One more example before we move on to the second type of transformation. If we looked at this, y equals x plus 2 squared minus 1. What is that plus 2 going to do? Move us left 2. You don't need to parrot other people. What about the negative 1? Down 1. So that's the first kind of idea. Questions on that before we look at what's called a reflection.
If it's a negative, like 2, it would go to the right. Like x minus.
Yeah, so if it was x minus 2 in parentheses, it'll go 2 to the right. Okay, next thing that we are talking about is what is called a reflection. A reflection just means we're dealing with a negative. The negative can be one of 2 places. The negative can be outside the parentheses or it can be inside the parentheses. Outside the parentheses reflects over the x-axis. What that means to you is all y's multiplied by a negative 1. If the negative is inside the parentheses, though, that means that all of the x's multiply by a negative 1, which would be a reflection over the y-axis. So here's what I'm talking about. Let's say that this is our graph f of x. If we put a negative outside, like number 1, what we're doing is we're taking all the y's and we're multiplying it by a negative. So all of these y's become negative. So this would be negative f of x. Instead, if the negative is in parentheses, it makes all of the x's multiply by a negative 1. So we take all of the x's, multiply them by a negative 1. So it would end up being over here. This is f of negative x. So we're starting out with all of the basic rules that you need to know. Last thing that you need to know is if there's a constant out in front, that you're either stretching or shrinking the graph. We're not going to focus on that too much. Questions before we look at some examples? Okay. I think if we just jump into some examples, we'll get a little bit of a better idea of how this is going to look. Example 1 is basically one type of problem that you're going to see. You have some point 2, -6 on f of x. We're finding the corresponding point on the following functions. Okay. There are 3 main ideas you need to know. These are the 3 rules that are going to guide how you do this. First rule. Anything in parentheses affects x if the number or the constant is outside the parentheses, it affects y. So anything you see inside parentheses is going to affect x. Second thing you need to know is that changes happen to x first, then to y. So if you're changing both x and y, you're going to do x first, then you're going to do y. And last rule to operate by is that reflections occur before movement. Okay, I've just thrown a lot of rules at you. If you can remember those 3, that'll help you. You'll be able to get through a lot of problems just by remembering those 3. So we're going to do some examples. We'll take a break, then we'll come back and finish. Everything is going to come down to this point 2, -6. So for every single problem, we're starting with the point 2, -6. Here's how you're going to operate. F of x plus 5. Here's what you need to know. Plus 5 is in parentheses. So is it going to affect x or y? X. It's going to affect x. If it affects x, we're moving left or right. Remember, with left or right, it's the opposite of what we think it should be. So we think it should be right 5. It's actually left 5. So we're taking the point 2, -6 and moving it left 5 units. Some of you can picture it in your head. If you can't picture it, you might want to draw the point. So there is our point 2, -6. And if we move it left 5, it'll end up over here somewhere. So that'll be the point -3, -6. Again, y is unchanged. X is the one that changes. Okay, f of x -4. -4 affect x or y? Y. Okay, affecting y. If it affects y, we're moving up or down. In this case, we are going to move down 4 units. So if we go back to our previous picture, this point right here, if we move it down 4 units, the coordinate will be 2, -10. C, with that negative, does that affect x or y? What? Y. It's outside the parentheses. It affects y. Okay, that negative, all it does is it multiplies y by a negative. So this is going to multiply y by a -1. So our point, instead of 2, -6, is going to become 2, +6. Okay, and then D. D is the first one where we have two things happening. Plus 2 in parentheses, so it's going to affect x. Negative 3 outside the parentheses, so it's going to affect y. The plus 2, what is that going to do to the point? It's going to move it left 2. The 3 is going to move us down 3. So then the question is, which one do I do first, the left or the down? It's always the x first. So I number it, x, then y. So I take my point to negative 6. If I move it left 2, so maybe you can picture it in your head, maybe you can't. So we have 2, negative 6. So there it is. So that will become 0, negative 6. And then if we move it down 3, it'll be 0, negative 9. What do we think so far? Questions? Not too bad. Okay, continuing on. With the next 4, we're going to be looking at 2 different transformations. So again, I go through, does it affect x or y? What does it do? What order do I need to do it in? For E, this negative 2, affect x or y? Y, because it's outside. Negative 1 is going to affect x. The negative 2 that's outside is going to multiply y by a negative 2. What is that negative 1 going to do that affects x? Right. Yep, opposite of what we think it's going to be. So we're going to go right 1. Which one happens first? X. X happens first, then y. Okay, so we take our 2, negative 6. If we move the point right 1, where is it going to be? 3, negative 6. And then we multiply y by a negative 2, so it's going to become 3, 12. Okay. F, that 1/2 affects y. The negative x affects x. And the plus 1 affects y. So again, outside parentheses or inside. 1/2 is going to multiply y by a 1/2. The negative 1 is going to multiply x by a negative 1. And that plus 1, what's that going to do? If it affects y, so it's going to move us up or down? Up. Okay, x happens first. So that change is going to happen first. When it comes to y, are we going to multiply by the 1/2 first or move it up 1? Multiply. Multiply always happens first. Then move. Okay, so we take our 2, negative 6. We multiply the x by a negative. So that becomes negative 2, negative 6. Then we multiply y by a 1/2. So that becomes negative 2, negative 3. And then if we move it up 1, that'll be negative 2, negative 2. Okay, G, we only have one thing that we're doing. What's happening in G? Down 7. Down 7. So if we take negative 6 and move it down 7, it'll be 2, negative 13. Okay, and then lastly, H. That negative affects y. The plus 2 affects x. The plus 3 affects y. We are going to multiply y by a negative. What does that plus 2 do? Left 2. It's the one that's opposite of what we think it should be. Plus 3 is going to move us up 3. What happens first? X. Then we multiply. Then we move. Okay, so we take our point 2, negative 6. If we move it left 2, that'll be 0, negative 6. Then we multiply y by a negative, so that's 0, positive 6. Lastly, moving it up 3 will be 0, 9. How do we feel about this?
Awesome.
Okay, not too bad? Okay, what I want you to do right now with your partner or your group is do example 2. This is what I got for example 2. Check your answers, please. How do we feel about this? Hey, you guys look like you did really well. I'm not gonna lie, I was pretty nervous to teach this because I think it's tough, but you all did very well. We do have one other problem to do. Okay, questions before our last 2.
Why does on C y become positive?
Because you're taking y and you're multiplying it by a negative. Okay, last 2 problems. If you have a phone out, please put it away so we can do these last 2. Okay, last 2. Instead of moving a point, this time you are moving an entire graph. So looking at part A, what's happening here? What do we have to do? Okay, so we're going to do left 1, down 2. Which one's going to happen first? Left. Okay, you see all these important points? Choose the important points and move those. So if I take the first point and I move it left 1 and down 2, that's right here. And then if I choose this point right here and I move it left 1 and down 2, that will give me the origin. Last point, if I move it left 2 and down 1, nope, sorry, left 1, down 2, will give me that. And lastly, you need to connect the points. Few things for us to be aware of. On a quiz, I'm not going to give us full credit for that. Why not? What am I missing? Arrow at the end. If there's an arrow here, you need to have an arrow there. Secondly, do you notice that it's the exact same shape, it just moved? That should always be the case. Either it moves or it gets bigger or smaller, but it's going to stay the same shape.
Do you want us to write the points, like when we get the new ones?
No, I'm fine if you graph like that. You don't have to write the coordinates. As long as you very clearly put a point there on the graph, that's enough.
Okay.
Last one, you all do part B, please. You do part B. So here's what I got in green. Multiplies all the y values by 2. So in this case, we're not moving anything. We are just stretching the graph. Questions? What do we think is easier, moving the point or moving the graph? For me, the graph is easier because I have a visual I can work with. For you all to know what to expect, your homework is moving graphs. On your test, you will have both. On your test, you will have both points and graphs. Sound good?